Okay, this project traces the relationship between Berlin and the River Spree from the mid-19th century to the present. So the Spree has a much longer history than what's covered here, but industrialization marks the moment when the city and the river became bound together in ways that still shape Berlin today. So my central argument is this: across every political era, industrial capitalism, Cold War division, post-reunification redevelopment, and the climate crisis, the Spree has functioned as a site where power is exercised over who gets access to the water, who bears the cost of that use, and whose relationship to the river is deemed legitimate. So the dominant stakeholder in each period engineered the river to serve their priorities. The people with the least power consistently paid the price. So what looks like urban development, border security, or ecological policy is usually, in each case, who the river is for. So industrialization. Factory owners and industrial planners cluster along the Spree because waterways cut transport costs. So it was like the coals went in, the goods went out, the machines were cooled and running. For capital, the river was an economic asset to be maximized. The river made Southeast Berlin's industrial corridor possible. So like over 19 kilometers squared, and eventually the largest continuous industrial region in the city. So it reshaped territorial development across the whole urban area. For the working class, the river meant something really different. The area became so thoroughly defined by industrial labor that it was simply called the Straße der Arbeit, or the street of work. Ew. Workers didn't control the river, but their lives were organized by it, so what public life they had often played along its banks. So that actually sounds pretty nice. I wouldn't want to live on the street of work though, but on Sundays, they went to the beaches on the Spree, escaping overcrowded homes for whatever outdoor space the waterfront offered. So work and leisure were both structured by the same geography. The state was the third stakeholder. The Teltow Canal and the Ritzer Branch Canal, which was built in 1901 to 1906, were acts of territorial reorganization that served as industrial interests while expanding state control over the movement of water through the city. The Johannesel Waterworks in 1901 to 1908, and the Woolhide Waterworks from 1914 to 1916 followed the same logic, planners engineering the river to sustain industrial capitalism. So the cost of this arrangement was pollution, for which nobody was held politically accountable. Shocker. Mineral oil, hydrocarbons, cyanide, arsenic, pesticide, heavy minerals, decades of industrial waste deposited into landfill layers, groundwater zones, and canal sediments. So by 1989 to 1901, the wells at Woolhide had to be shut down entirely, and the workers who had built the industrial city along the rivers were also the ones drinking its water. So power and costs were distributed along class lines, and the river was a medium through which that distribution happened. So the post-war division of Berlin fundamentally altered the river's political function, where industrialization had made the Spree a site of economic production and contested public life. The GDR state remade it as territorial infrastructure. So it was a border, a surveillance zone, and a killing ground. The border between Kreuzberg in West Berlin and Friedrichshain in East Berlin ran along the Spree. So East Berlin controlled the entire width of the river, and the wall occupied the eastern bank. Buildings along the embankment were gradually removed through the 1970s to give border soldiers an unobstructed line of fire. So the area raised entirely by 1977. Many people died in the Spree trying to cross, including children who drowned when rescuers were not permitted to enter the water to save them. So The stakeholders were starkly asymmetric, and the GDR state controlled the river completely and used that control to enforce immobility. The Sunday beaches, the working class leisure culture that had defined the waterfront for a century, was gone, and ordinary East Berliners had no legitimate claim to the water at all. The river was now a space where presence meant the risk of death. So West Berliners on the opposite bank could see the river, but they couldn't reach it, and the Spree's role as a border eclipsed all other possibilities, and Berlin's relationship to its own river lay dormant for decades. So the wall came down in 1989, and the Spree was suddenly available again, but available to whom and on whose terms was immediately contested. So the industrial sites that had lined the river were now vacant. Developers and city planners identified the waterfront as Berlin's most valuable redevelopment opportunity. So what emerged was Media Spree, and this was a major initiative covering around 180 hectares along 3.7 kilometers of the Spree, and that was in Friedrichshain Kreuzberg. And converted former industrial sites and Cold War-era border wastelands into office spaces, luxury lofts, hostels, and entertainment venues. And the city government was using the existing club culture, and subcultural enterprises that had taken root in the 1990s as a promise of successful development. And then they just proceeded to displace exactly those uses in favor of corporate tenants and luxury real estate. So the relationship between work and leisure, which has structured the river's social meaning since industrialization, reappeared here but in a new form. The leisure culture of the post-war waterfront was first absorbed as an asset and then discarded as an inconvenience. So residents, artists, and community groups pushed back. The initiative Media Spree Verkessen formed in 2007 to protest gentrification and the privatization of this public space along the river. So a referendum in July 2008 resulted in a victory for citizen initiatives, but development continued. A section of the Eastside Gallery, a memorial to the city's division, was torn down to allow residents to access luxury apartments. So 3 stakeholders. Developers wanted the waterfront as an investment space. The city government wanted it as an economic engine and an image asset. Residents and subcultural communities wanted it as public space. So the referendum was one of those rare moments where the third group won something, and the broader trajectory was not in their favor. The most recent chapter repeats old patterns. So the state is engineering the river to serve dominant priorities, but with costs distributed unevenly. So we've seen this before. Reunification forced a reckoning within the industrial period's contamination. So in 1993, the river region was officially designated as a large-scale economic redemption project. So more than 35 groundwater treatment plants, over 2 million tons of contaminated soil removed, 64,000 tons of contaminated canal sediment cleared. The total remediation cost was approximately $293 million by 2025, and the state has once engineered the river to serve industrial growth, but it was now engineering it to undo the consequences of that growth. So climate change is adding new pressure. During dry summers, treated wastewater can make up to 50% of the Spree's flow at some measuring points. So the water levels have dropped enough that the downstream flow from Lake Gudessie can reverse entirely. An agreement between federal waterway authorities and the Berlin Senate now governs how weirs and locks are managed. They want to mitigate flooding. Environmental scientists and advocacy groups are pushing for ecological restoration. They're also pushing for genuine public access to the riverbanks at the same demand, but in a different register. The Media Spree protesters were making a decade earlier. So swimming, working-class leisure in the Spree was banned since 1925, but it returned as a live political issue. For nearly a century, Berliners had been cut off from swimming in their own river after a poor water quality forced the closure of the last public swimming facility in 1925. The Fischbad Berlin project proposes to transform a 745-meter stretch of the Spree Canal into a natural swimming zone. The through line holds who controls the water, controls how costs and access are distributed across the city. So the Spree didn't become political at any single moment. It always was political. It's been a transport corridor, a kill zone, a development opportunity, a climate variable, and through all of this, the same water moving through the same city. The photographs anchor that continuity, and the sketches show what was replaced and what stayed the same, in kind of like a loose, sketchy way, but I think you can see the shape of things. Together they make visible the thing that the project has argued in this video essay form, that every era's version of the river is a claim about who gets access and who pays the cost. So while the vocab changes, the structure really doesn't. Thank you.